Logic magicians, we are the best. Logic magicians, we know what's up. Logic magicians, we're inside your head. That's why we are the best.
Hi, everyone. We're the Logic Magicians, and we're going to be doing a series that is kind of exploring topics within logic, communication, and all different kinds of stuff that ties into that we're interested in, including, of course, Zach's magic. To kind of start things off, there you go. To kind of start things off, we're just going to introduce ourselves a little bit to kind of give you an idea of why we're doing this project, who we are, and then our topic for the day is actually going to be talking about and exploring what I consider to be kind of the fundamentals and essential component in when you're starting to learn about logic, and that is the difference between subjective statements and objective statements. But before we get to that, let's go ahead and do some introductions. Would you like to go ahead and go first?
Oh, of course I would. Hello, everybody. My name is Zach Payne. I grew up in Kentucky and then moved to Illinois. I met Johnny Graz in Missouri, where we went to a school called Evangel University. I graduated there with a degree, a bachelor's style in communication studies. And then I sold cars for a while, and then I got Johnny a job selling cars. That was fun. And then
Was it?
And then I have a master's degree in organizational communication from SIUE, and I've lived over in the Europe side of the world for the last 3 years. That's me.
Awesome. Cool. Hi, everyone. My name... Sorry, what?
Who are you?
My name is Jonathan Gratza. Yeah, I guess if we're going like as far back as childhood, I grew up in Budapest, Hungary, in Europe. It's in Central Europe. Lived there till about 2 weeks before I went to college in Missouri. So that was fun. Fun little transition there. Zach got to meet me during that time. Yeah, we were roommates in college. And then I actually got my undergraduate degree in journalism, had like 2 or 3 minors, I can't remember. And then I got a master's degree in religious studies. And I really focused, not in religious talking, no. Definitely the studies aspect. It's primarily focusing on like sociology and history of religion. And yeah, my research is always focused on kind of the spread of ideas, which I find to be fascinating. The reason I think that, we're relatively qualified to have a conversation about this stuff, I actually teach logic and rhetoric at a school up in New England. Now that's kind of where I've landed.
And I've been... So that's good enough, right?
There you go. But especially like with, we're using this as an opportunity to kind of reconnect, to talk about things we're interested in, and to, maybe make something out of this. We'll see how it goes. So yeah, I've been teaching logic and rhetoric for a couple of years now. I love it. One of my several minors in undergrad was philosophy, and I feel like once you get a master's degree and you write your comprehensive exams or a thesis like I did, you kind of have to further develop your logic and argumentation skills. And then I kind of ended up in a teaching position where I've had to not only teach that, but also continue to develop my own understanding of the topic. So it's going to be fun. It's going to be a pretty relaxed exploration of various topics within the logic and rhetoric and communication and magic. It'll be fun. It'll be fun. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive in. So
what are we today, Mr. Gratza?
Oh goodness. Okay. Yeah,
Wait,
before
we do that.
Yeah.
So when Johnny and I were roommates, we were top bunk and bottom bunk. I was on top and he was on bottom, and we would stay up all night. discussing and solving all of the world's problems. And so some of the idea of this, whatever this is to tap back into that time when we were solving the world's problems, and we're going to fix everything, right?
Obviously, that is within the realm of possibility of this project. Yeah, I was gonna say we need like some Oreos and milk or some chips and salsa for this to be authentic, but oh well. But yeah, it's gonna be a fun time, and definitely a lot more relaxed than like my classrooms are.
Yeah, if you see me falling asleep, that's okay.
Okay, so let's go ahead and dive in. So today we're going to be talking about subjective and objective. And before we kind of dive into the specifics of it, again, I just kind of want to re-highlight what I mentioned in the introduction, which is I consider this to be kind of the first step in really exploring what logic is, because you have to be able to distinguish between subjective and objective statements to actually even determine the type of logic that you use in an argumentation. And not even just argumentation. By arguments, we don't mean like yelling matches or, you know, all caps comments on social media. We mean having discussions about stuff. But it's not only useful for that, but I think it's useful for people to kind of evaluate their own thoughts, their own ideas, their own beliefs, their own understanding of the world. And this is really like the crucial first step. So, Zach, I want this to be a lot more of like a dialogue, but what do you think when you hear the word subjective and objective? Like what comes to mind? What do you think those terms mean?
Well, the way I was taught in 4th grade science class was that subjective is personal opinions or ideas that can be true or false, and objective ideas are true.
Okay, so that's actually a
statement.
really good place to start off.
Because I started in 4th grade. Let's do it.
I was going to say, yeah, I start my students off in 7th grade with some logic, so that's it's pretty fun. So that's actually a pretty good start. You actually, from like a technical perspective, you kind of combine the two. So actually, my definition and the definition I teach for objective statements.
Combining the two, would that be subjective?
We'll get into that. It would again, since we're working with definitions, it's a little bit more fluid of a concept there. But we'll talk about that in a bit. Oh gosh, yeah, you just jumped like 20 minutes ahead. So objective statements are actually statements that you can prove true or false. So that's why I said you kind of combine the two. If you can prove it true or false, then it is an objective statement. And the example I always give for this is something like, it is raining. Actually, it was raining all day today. It happens to be a little bit sunny out right now, but that's an objective statement because you can look outside, you can confirm whether or not it is raining. If it is raining, then this statement was true. If it's not raining, then the statement is false.
Now, what kind of influence would you say the trust that you put into the person telling you it's raining has?
Oh, there's a whole topic on credibility that comes into play. For now, and again, that's definitely something that I want to explore later in the series. For now, I will say that from a logical perspective, it's irrelevant. The logic of a person's argument doesn't depend on who's the one giving the argument, but as you know, even just instinctively you would react, that clearly does matter from an argumentation perspective. So logically, how much you trust the person doesn't matter, but from an argument or rhetorical perspective, communication perspective, clearly we all know that it matters whether or not you trust the person who's telling you it's raining or not. And we'll definitely dive into that. That's just for those of you who are watching. That's called ethos, or the credibility of the speaker, and it's one of kind of the 3 pillars of rhetoric, the 3 rhetorical appeals, one of which is ethos.
If you're from ancient Greece, that is.
That's true. That's true. Yeah. Otherwise, we could use the less snooty term and just call it credibility, or as one of my students put it, clout. how much clout a person has. So
Clout with a K, right?
I
I'm joking. That
was gonna say,
was
I'm like, ah.
measured how influential you were. I don't think
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So that's an objective statement. So it's something that can be proven true or false. And then there are subjective statements, which are things that can't be proven true or false. And like you said, it tends to be statements of personal preference. Oftentimes, you can actually substitute the word subjective statement with a preference statement, with saying it's a preference statement. And these are things that can't be proven true or false. These aren't facts. These are personal opinions, personal beliefs, personal, preferences, that things you might prefer over another.
Saying that you can't prove what I like best is true. So if I say I like chocolate best, that's a true statement. That's objective.
So so we can talk about that. Yes, that actually is technically an objective statement. And I know we were talking about this a little bit before we started recording. And it's technically an objective statement, but it's functionally a subjective statement. And I'll explain why after I nuance subjective statements just a little bit. To really demonstrate the difference between objective and subjective, I use the example like there's a substantive, essential difference between the statement, it's raining outside, and rain is the best. And I actually really like that you use the word best, because that's oftentimes a really good keyword to pick up on that something is subjective, right?
So
a person
objectively anything is the best.
Again, in certain contexts you can, specifically if you're giving like a point of reference, and again, I keep saying like we'll get into that, but there's like a process to understanding these things. So you can, but it only works objectively if you have a really specific and narrowly defined understanding of the word best. But otherwise, it's generally going to be a preference statement. So if with it raining, you can look outside, determine whether or not it's raining. But if I say rain is the best, I mean, that's going to depend on your personal experience with rain, on your entire life and all your connotations with rain. It would depend on like what context you're talking about rain. Like, yeah, it's best if there's a drought. No, it's probably not the best if you're having flash floods in the area, right? So there's a lot more that goes into that that particular statement. So Zach,
would that be defined as context?
Yes, yes, definitely. And again, we'll talk about these things, and we'll see that this kind of strong distinction between the two, especially like I told Zach, we're really not wanting to get into a whole lot of epistemology early on. And epistemology is kind of the study of how things are true, or how things, period, and truth values, things like that. And we'll definitely want to kind of explore that later on down the road. But for now, we do want to keep things a little bit more simple, a little bit more accessible. So Zach, I want to kind of go back to your statement of, I think you said, I like rain the best.
I said chocolate the best.
Oh, I like chocolate. Sorry, I don't know why I'm stuck on the rain metaphor or example. I like chocolate the best. So what I said was that is technically an objective statement, but it functions like a subjective statement. Now, the reason I say that it is an objective statement is because the grammatical structure of that statement, right? The verb.
Grammar has to do with objective now.
Grammar has to do with everything. Oh, well, actually, at our school, it is actually an English class, but yeah, it's categorized as an English class. Yeah, we do a lot of writing.
Mathematics.
They actually, I have gotten some feedback from some of the math teachers that because I teach a lot of the concepts that they go over, and actually geometry, students have been able to make that connection.
Cool.
So yeah. So so that part does come down to grammar. The reason I say it's technically objective, but it functions as subjective. So the sentence, I think chocolate is best. If you break it down, you have the verb, which is think, and you have the subject, which is I. So I think, and then you're describing what you think. That is technically something we could determine is true or false. We could hook you up to a polygraph test. We could ask you, all the baseline
Those aren't always
questions.
reliable.
That's true. And again, we get into like the reliability of information.
I
And
would say
another,
an fMRI machine would be more apt to really tell.
I'll definitely trust. I'll trust your expertise on that a lot more than I would trust my own. I don't know why, but I will. But one thing that I forgot to add to the definition of an objective statement is something that can be proven true or false, or you can think of a way to prove it true or false. That's actually a really important component to it as well, because before I finish analyzing your earlier statement. So for example, if I say that, there is a spaceship made of chocolate 15 billion light years away.
There's no
right?
way to prove that.
So that's the thing is that is technically an objective statement because we could invent a machine that can go faster than light, or we could set up a long distance space colony that slowly travels that far and over time would make it there, etc., whatever. But there would be a way to test for that. We just don't have the means to test for that. So it's still technically an objective statement. We just can't actually know whether it's true or false, but it is possible to know whether it's true or false. So that's actually a pretty important distinction.
So, but objective does not mean true.
Objective does not mean true. No. Saying, so this is a cat, right? That's an objective statement. It's an objectively false statement.
Oh.
Yeah.
I'm going to start using that. I'm going to be like, you are objectively false, because that seems like it would be a lot better of a burn than being like, you're wrong.
Sure. Yeah, that's those are some strong words.
Yes. I get into a lot of arguments, I'm very argumentative.
Yes. Yes. Like just by your very nature. Significantly more argumentative than I am. Everyone watching, that is sarcasm. I'm definitely the more argumentative of the two. So to kind of go back, so grammatically speaking, what you're saying is I think, and then you're specifying what you're thinking, right? So we can test for that. We can test to see whether or not that is actually what you think. So that makes it technically an objective statement. However, the reason I say that it functions like a subjective statement is because you're not trying to communicate what you think, right? Where you're not trying to communicate that I have the thought that chocolate is best. What you're actually trying to communicate is that chocolate is the best, right? So just because you
disagree with that, and what if I say, oh, that's interesting. So if I say I have the thought that chocolate is best, it's no longer subjective.
Yeah, that's objective, and even if you say I think chocolate is the best, that's still technically an objective statement. We can check to see whether or not that's what you think. But generally speaking, when people use a statement starting with I think or I believe or in my experience or something like that, right? Those are all things that we can test for, but they're not trying to communicate the fact that this is my experience or this is my belief. They're trying to communicate some sort of opinion with that or some sort of kind of weighted truth with that. And so I treat those statements like they're subjective because I don't, again, it's one of those things where like, if we're talking about like just the thoughts that we have, like the other day, I thought that, fill in the blank, then yeah, we're using them like objective sentences and you're just collecting data on like quantitatively how often you think of something or how much you think of something, or I don't know, the thoughts you have in a day. But functionally, how people actually use them are generally in a subjective manner. They're actually focusing on the subjective content of that statement, which is chocolate is the best. And saying chocolate is the best is subjective. So even though technically, grammatically, the statement is objective because you're just describing what you think, and we can test for that, the focus and the emphasis that you're placing on and what you actually want to focus on from a rhetorical or argumentative perspective is the subjective content, which is chocolate is the best.
I learned today
There are actually a couple of different types of sentences that are neither subjective nor objective.
What are they
You know what they
called?
are? Oh, I was going to ask. Can you guess what they are?
Uh, Neither objective nor subjective. So let's put a nay in there. Neceptive.
No.
What are they? I
They're
don't.
type. Okay, so the first one is actually questions. Questions don't carry truth value.
I
A
disagree. What about leading questions?
That's still, if it's a question, then it's neither true or false. If I say, "What time is it, Zach?" Is that true or false?
Huh. But they can function uh, in a way, right? Like,
Sure, absolutely. I mean, you can, people make implications through questions all the time.
are you still
And
beating your wife?
yes, oh, so that's actually a logical fallacy called a loaded question, which we'll
Not
get into
begging
that.
the question?
No, begging the question is actually different. And I actually told Zach that one of the first times I was teaching logic, I actually confused the two. So I have a class of seventh graders who will confuse the two, but I'll get them again next year, so I'll be able to correct that mistake. That is a loaded question, which is asking a question that has an implied or an implicit um, understanding that the person has to that the person agrees to, basically no matter how they answer the question. So it's a clarify and bring it all together. It's asking a question that, regardless of how a person responds to, they are agreeing to an implied premise.
But I'm thinking of leading questions in a cross-examination, like in a courtroom.
Sure. So again, you could still, even if you do like something like, is it true that chocolate is your favorite? Right? That the question on its own is still neither subjective nor objective. The response to it will be subjective or objective, but the question itself is not. It doesn't carry any truth value because you're not making a statement.
Even though it carries a weight and influences the people in.
Yeah. And again, like, the same way that I said that I think statements are technically objective but can function or do function as subjective. You can have the same thing with that. You can have a question that, just because you phrase something as a question, you might be using it, like you said, in that leading manner, that have either implied statements in them or implied facts or subjective or objective statements. So it can certainly function, but on its kind of face value, it is neither subjective nor objective.
Well, isn't that neat?
Yeah, there's one more. There's one more type.
That was a question that I was saying.
That's true. That is true. Yeah, there you go. That's actually a really good example. That's awesome. So there's one more type, and there might be more. These are just the two that I usually teach that are neither subjective nor objective. So you got questions. It's number 2.
Exclamation.
Yeah, actually, kind of.
Really?
Yeah, kind of. So commands.
Yeah, stop.
Yeah, commands are neither subjective nor objective. So if I say, eat your chocolate, since we're going with the chocolate example, if I say eat your chocolate, that's neither subjective nor objective. I'm not making
and if you make that a question, then it's neither subjective.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So again, like, if you're encountering an argument, questions or commands don't function as well. I should not say it that way. Questions or commands are neither objective nor subjective, but depending on context, they can function as subjective or objective. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So what do you do with that?
So I'm glad you asked that. So this is, like I said, this is really important because there are 2 primary types of logic that we generally use as critical thinkers or as non-critical thinkers. So again, just because people aren't necessarily aware of their thought processes or self-aware about what they say, oftentimes people are using well, I say oftentimes just to use mitigating language, but pretty much always we're going to be using some of the following types of logic. And the type of logic that you use to argue something depends on whether you're arguing for an objective or a subjective conclusion.
And that's deductive and inductive?
That, yes, exactly. That's
Not to be
exactly right.
confused with convection and traditional ovens.
I don't know if anyone was confusing that before now, but
well, now they're definitely not.
Yeah. But yeah, yeah, those are the two types of logic that people generally use.
I have a very vague grasp of the two. I know that deductive, one is working from the outside in, and the other is from out into the outside. Is that right?
Yeah, so that's generally how it's described. I personally I'm not the biggest fan of those definitions because it is kind of generalizing things that in a manner that's not always accurate. So for example, like, deductive logic is usually described as going from the specific example to a general example or a general understanding, whereas inductive logic is going from the general to the specific. And that's not actually always the case. In deductive logic, you can go from specific to specific. You can actually do that with inductive logic as well. So that's not a bad way to define it for kind of like a broad understanding of them. But there's actually some there's quite a few instances where that description does not actually end up being super accurate. So the way I define deductive logic is it's an argument that uses only objective statements. It follows strict logical structures. And these structures are actually mathematical. So there's all kinds of mathematical proofs behind them. These are called inference rules. So there's a set of inference rules.
A equals B, B equals C, A equals C.
So yeah, so it's not quite equals, but it's if A then B, if B then C, therefore if A then C. Yeah, that kind of stuff. Where it's very mathematical logic. It's used in programming a lot. It's used in math a lot. I actually was first introduced to it during a math class in high school, and it's often called mathematical logic or deductive logic. And so it follows really strict, equations, logical equations to come to, and then this is kind of my third part of my definition for deductive logic, which is it comes to, if you've done everything correctly, then it comes to a necessarily true conclusion. If you have true objective statements in your deductive logical argument and you follow these equations correctly or in a valid manner, which is like the actual vocab for that term, and you come to a sound conclusion, then you come to a necessarily true conclusion. There's really no arguing with your conclusion. It is true.
All men are named Carl. Carl is a woman, therefore that's not a sound conclusion.
No, yeah, though you're not really
I don't
connecting the premises. No, so the example I think it's because I usually teach this around like winter time, but my example that I use in all my classes for an example of deductive logic is if it is snowing, then I must clean my car. It is snowing, therefore I must clean my car.
And you're talking about like vacuuming the inside and getting all of the chicken wrappers out.
Exactly. No, I'm talking about wiping off the snow from the car. So yeah, that is kind of my definition for deductive logic. Give me 1 second.
I don't know. Maybe it's because I'm a communications background and find it very difficult to. I don't see how you could speak an only objective.
No, you can't. You really can't. No, and I really try to emphasize this for my students as well. Subjective isn't bad. We use subjectives. Again, this is anecdotal and this is not proper logic. It is well, not even necessarily subjective. It's generalization based on insufficient data. But I would say we probably use subjective statements significantly more often than we use objective statements, and we use the other type of logic significantly more. And that's not a bad thing. That's like, subjective doesn't mean bad, even though bad's a subjective term. You just have to be aware of it. You just have to be aware of what statements you're making, what conclusions you're coming to, and making sure you're using the correct and appropriate logic in arguing those. So yeah, I definitely don't want to give people the impression that, like, oh, I can't say rain is the best. No, that's fine. Go ahead and say that. Or, you know, you think chocolate is the best, etc. That's totally fine. That's logically fine as well. No one's going to say, like, oh, well, that's bad logic. It's not. It's just a subjective statement, and you have to use a particular type of logic to argue it.
Okay.
And that brings us to our kind of next definition, which is our other type of logic, which is inductive logic.
Oh, no.
Yeah, inductive logic. And yeah, inductive logic is, I you know, again, I teach this to younger children, so I try to, you know, go with threes and kind of have definitions that mirror each other. So my definition for inductive logic kind of mirrors my definition for in deductive logic. And so my definition for inductive logic is uses both subjective and objective statements.
So if I use only subjective statement, that's not inductive?
That is, or it can be and or, I guess, so it uses subjective and or objective statements. Is either strong or weak.
What does that mean?
I'll actually, those are some more terms that I actually specifically define. And comes to a subjective conclusion.
Which is always bad, right?
No. And so that's something that I think oftentimes people don't realize, is that you can't start from a subjective perspective and have an objective conclusion. So not, maybe perspective is not the right word. You can't start with a subjective statement and come to an objective conclusion, right? Objective can lead to objective, and objective can lead to subjective, but subjective can only ever lead to subjective. And that's, I think, what I see very regularly, especially online, is people treating subjective statements like they're objective, and then they like start off with a preference statement, and then they end on a true, like, or true, something they consider to be true, or an objective statement. And you can't do that logically. That really doesn't work. You can come to a strong conclusion or a probable conclusion based on that, but you can't come to necessarily like an objective, like, this is, you know, we know for sure that this is true, kind of a statement.
Can we know anything is true? That's epistemological.
That's a much later conversation. Yeah, that's epistemology, and we're avoiding that for now.
Okay. What about ontology? Should we just hop into that?
Oh man, wow. No.
Yeah, we're not. Yeah. What about oncology? That's
definitely not my field of study. So we can avoid that for now. Okay. But you asked earlier, like the difference between strong or a weak argument.
Yeah.
And I actually I define this pretty specifically, and then I actually have a way to demonstrate this as well. So this kind of what?
Do you lift weights?
Yes. Yep. For strength.
It's strong.
Yeah.
Get up here, and then you start picking on your kids.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. No. I get like a big old desk, and I like bench press it. This is bench pressing. That's curling. Clearly, I know what I'm talking about. And then I tell my students to do the same. No. So strong and weak. And this is actually going to, kind of depending on how the series goes and when we get more into communication, this definition actually is really important, specifically for organization of your arguments. I know, you know, Zach, I'm sure you're familiar with this type of organization, but generally speaking, for academic papers, they tell you to put your best points later. So put You basically want to leave your reader with your best points as the last thing they read. And
that's why I always put them at the very first sentence, because nobody reads after that.
well, I mean, well, you're talking about the inverted pyramid, which is definitely, like, I think very relevant to our current short term, or not even short term, but short attention span media consumption, which again, that's actually a journalistic type and approach to reading. And absolutely, like, again, you may actually want to consider putting things first, the most important stuff first.
What about an Oreo sandwich? Put it first, you put it last. You just don't do anything in the middle.
So, like, you skip the best part of the Oreo? Yeah. Yeah. But again, just these definitions I'm giving for strong or weak actually really helps, and I tell my students that this is what they should use to determine, really helps determine how to organize your points. And you usually want to go from weakest to strongest, and actually using these following definitions I'm going to be giving. And so my definition for strong is uses mostly objectively true statements.
I'm writing that down. Uses mostly objectively
true statements. So again, just because you use objective statements doesn't make it strong, because again, I could say
a lot of objectively false.
Yeah, exactly. Like, if this is a cat, then
this is a cat.
Yeah, I could say if this is a cat, then that's a cat. This is a cat, therefore that's a cat. That's actually using a deductive logic structure, but that's not a strong argument, because it's nonsense.
No, it's not strong.
And yeah, so that's my definition for strong, is uses mostly objectively true statements. And then my definition for weak is kind of a mirror image of this, which is uses mostly subjective statements.
So you are saying that subjective statements are equal to objectively false statements, therefore subjective is bad.
No, and again, I don't necessarily nuance this for my seventh graders, but especially in inductive logic, subjective statements are actually very important. Most of your interpretation of facts happens through subjective statements. And as we'll talk about later, facts on their own are really not sufficient.
And they don't care about your feelings either.
Oh gosh, let's not go there. So, oh boy. Wow, okay, that threw me. No, you're good. You're good. I can't remember what I was saying.
You're saying that facts something don't stand on their own, or
oh yeah. So facts don't actually so they provide some information, but they don't always, or in fact I would even say rarely, do they provide sufficient or useful information, right? Just because I tell you what temperature it is outside, that doesn't necessarily give you enough information to determine what your day is going to be like, right? So facts on their own require interpretation. That's something that we're going to be talking about further on as we go in this series. But I again want to highlight that subjective statements are not inherently bad. They serve a very important purpose, specifically when it comes to interpreting data. A lot of the various frameworks we're going to, like, communication theory, like agenda setting theory, things like that, the interpretation that's going on, that's mostly subjective stuff, right? They're saying, like, hey, this is what I found that works, or has a somewhat reliably predictable outcome. But again, determining what's reliable is certainly subjective. So again, subjective arguments certainly play a very important role in inductive logic. And a lot of the frameworks you're using, interpretive models you're using, are going to be subjective. But you still need to have facts to interpret. So if all you're doing is interpreting opinions, then it doesn't actually lead to a strong argument.
fact, but that would be like an objectively true statement.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah, those are kind of interchangeable. So a
Okay,
fact would be an objectively true statement.
cool.
And yeah, so a weak inductive logical argument is going to be an argument that uses mostly subjective statements. And then there's a kind of a third vocab term that I like to teach, kind of as almost an intro to rhetoric or introducing students to kind of basic concepts within rhetoric. And that's an effective argument.
With that
So
A or
an effective argument. And basically, an effective argument is really any argument that achieves its goal.
so
Right?
I
It
can
doesn't.
have completely weak, inductive, purely objectively false argument, and if I achieve the goal of climbing a mountain, or just kidding, that was
Yeah.
if I achieve the goal of convincing you,
Yep.
then I win.
Yeah. Then it's an effective. It's an effective argument. And this is where communication theory and rhetoric comes into play. That's what rhetoric is. It's crafting effective arguments. Now, ideally, your audience would be critical thinkers, and so strong or sound arguments would be kind of a prerequisite for an effective argument, but that's certainly not always the case. The example I always...
You can teach them whatever you want.
Oh yeah, no, it's interesting. Like after I kind of teach a few concepts, I actually even ask my students, I'm like, so why do you never question me on any of this stuff? Like, how do you know I'm right? And then they all panic, and it's amusing. Yeah, so effective arguments. And the example I really like to give is, and this again, we'll talk about target audiences, things like that. If the following argument, if you don't like pizza, is not going to be effective for you, but I'm kind of targeting people who like pizza. So if if we were hanging out in person and I came, back to the dorm room. Yes, definitely social distancing. But let's say I brought up a pizza, and I actually have it in, a fully sealed bag. So yeah, it's safe and all that. But I bring up a pizza and I say, man, this crust is like the perfect level of crunchy and soft. And the sauce has just the right amount of oregano in it. And the cheese is just so gooey that it is amazing. Would you like a slice? Would you be convinced to have a slice?
I would say the box is unopened. How do you know that?
Now you're coming back with epistemology. I said we're going to skip that for now.
Dang, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
I would be more swayed than I would be otherwise if you said, this is Little Caesar's pizza. Do you want a slice?
Oh, man. College and Little Caesars. Oh, boy. There are some memories. But, let's, for argument's sake, let's assume that, oh, man, you hear that and you're like, oh, man, that sounds great. I'd love a slice. I achieved my goal. My goal was to offer you and to get you to have a slice of pizza. Now, was that a strong or a weak argument?
It was an effective argument.
It was, but let's talk within terms of strong or weak.
Oh, that was a weak argument because you used all subjective terms.
Exactly.
However, you did mention oregano, and oregano is a spice which has to be measured very carefully. So maybe you're onto something. Maybe you are objective.
I was gonna say, if there's an objective amount of oregano that is perfect, but again, especially since I said that it's the perfect amount of oregano, right? That's super duper subjective, right? That is literally going to be dependent on your culinary context and background. And if maybe your family growing up loved oregano and you put it on everything, you might think no, this is you need I don't know, 2 more tablespoons of oregano in it or something like that. Or maybe you're allergic to oregano, right? I don't actually know if that's a thing, but let's say you were.
Maybe, but what if you knew that and you said that there's a perfect amount of oregano in this?
That's true. So yeah, so again, but again, just saying that it's going to depend on the person. That again is showing that it's subjective, but it can still be an effective argument. So again, that's something I like to point out to people regarding that particular thing. Hey everyone, sorry for kind of the abrupt ending. The first video we recorded ended up being significantly longer than we had intended, so we're going to be splitting it up into 2 videos. So we're going to end this video here, and then please join us next time for the continuation of our discussion of subjective and objective. Zach, if you can play us out.
Logic magicians, we are logical, and I'm a magician.
Perfect. Okay, see you next time, everyone.
Bye, everybody.